So I believe we are now live, and so I'm just going to check because I'm not 100% sure. Says we should be. Sorry about this.
No, take your time.
When you love technology. Okay, yeah, we are live. So, Professor, it is an honour to have you here. You're a applied social psychology professor with a focus in LGBTQI plus diversity and health. Maybe you could start by explaining what that means and what you do in that scope.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. And with every full professorship, there comes you have to have a denomination of what you're doing research on, and my denomination is applied social psychology. That means that I do research on the perception of individuals and their experiences and their behavior in a social context, and I do that in a specific area of interest of mine that's close to my heart, and that is LGBTQI plus diversity and health. And what does that mean? Individuals that associate themselves with all these letters LGBTQI plus often experience health disparities, mental health disparities, and these disparities are due to often a lack of diversity, a lack of acceptance, or if you turn it negatively, more discrimination, and that has negative effects on their lives. And my research is on, first of all, unraveling these processes and also coming up with suggestions, very hands-on, how to improve that on a societal level, but also for Maastricht University.
So that's a lot in one title. You spoke briefly about your research. Maybe you'd like to elaborate on the kinds of questions you like to look at personally.
Well, at the moment I do a lot of research on the topic of HIV prevention, especially the biomedical form of HIV prevention, PrEP, which is a very hot topic for the G, the gay men, or as we often refer to them in very technical terms, MSM, standing for men having sex with men. But that is also an interesting topic for transgender individuals, but also for women that, for example, work as a sex worker. So it's not limited to MSM entirely. I've been doing some work that's very specific on the effects of facial feminization surgery for male to female transgender individuals, and I've been working more general on sort of the mental health of the whole spectrum of LGBTQI, and that can be, how do we improve inclusion at the workplace, what does it mean to be HIV positive, but also very hands-on, how can we improve the learning context and situation for students that are maybe coming out as lesbian or gay or bisexual or transgender at Maastricht University, so that they feel safe and at home in our tutoring system of problem-based learning.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Maybe just quickly, you would actually like to elaborate on what you've suggested be done to make students feel more at home.
Well, I think it first of all, it requires an understanding among tutors and staff that first-year students come to university, and that is sort of a major change in their lives, and maybe they have had feelings for the same sex before, but they haven't done anything because they were living at home and it didn't really. There were opportunities for it, and now they're coming to university, and it all has to happen now. But that pathway can also be quite rocky and bumpy, and then it's important for teaching staff and tutors to understand that someone may self-identify as heterosexual in the first semester and self-identifies as homosexual in the second semester, and maybe self-identify as not interested in sex at all in the third semester, or coming out as transgender. And I think what we have to understand is that sexuality and sexual orientation and sexual identity is very fluid, and we have to accommodate that. And that also requires that when we do for example, the typical introduction in problem-based learning in tutor groups, that we introduce ourselves as oftentimes in very heteronormative ways, and I would like to have an impact on the education also of tutors to be more open and allow that many different forms are the norm or can be the norm, and not the fact that everybody has to have a family and children and a dog, and that's sort of your wet dream of a good life. And there are current debates that also hit Maastricht University or start to hit Maastricht University. To give you an example, we have in Anglo-Saxon universities a much broader reception of the pronoun debate. Do you identify as he or she or they? And that's something we need to discuss in the next years in Maastricht, and also see how we're going to incorporate that or how it does not fit into the academic climate of Maastricht University. It's not an easy answer, and then it's really hands-on. How do we make this work and make it work that it's safe and positive for everybody?
That's very interesting, and it is interesting coming from a even more Anglo-Saxon environment. You see that a lot of people who use English as their second language kind of go, they is plural, it's plural, never. And it's very interesting to see that divide where you go, well, it's fluid, you should use it in a more interesting way.
But that's exactly the challenge. We do have at Maastricht University a large number of international students. And if they understand that they is plural, and suddenly someone comes and says, well, I identify as they, and then the students actually fall behind because they don't understand to whom are we referring? Are we referring to a larger group of people, or are we referring to just one individual that goes by they? Such a pronoun discussion can have a significant impact on their learning outcomes. And that's something we need to solve and discuss and see how we can make it fit. So I'm neither nor a big fan or strongly against it. I think this has to be incorporated in a university culture, and we have to find ways how to do that, but in a way so that we don't leave anyone behind, but also make advocates of the pronoun discussion aware that it's not that easy, and that when we say, well, we have to think about this a bit longer, it's not because we don't want to, but because you don't want to confuse students for whom English is still a challenge, and they go like, what? What are we talking about?
So that was arguably the slightly lighter end of your work. On the slightly more troubling end, you've done research into hate crimes against LGBTQI persons. Maybe you'd like to expand on your findings there.
Sure, it's you called it the sort of the not so light end of my research. Well, LGBTQI individuals worldwide suffer from hate crimes more often than members of a majority, and the big problem is that in many countries, and even in the Netherlands, victims of LGBT hate crimes do not really go to the police because they are afraid of being ridiculed, being not taken seriously. Luckily, that is changing. There is the pink and blue, the Rose and Blau police unit. But even that existence of that police unit is not a guarantee that you're being dealt with in an adequate way. And so we have been doing research, especially about the reporting function of victims of hate crimes, and we can see that in European data, but also in Dutch data, in most cases do not report the hate crime. So there is a very huge known unknown. It happens much more often than we know of because the victims are the gatekeepers of the system, but if they are not reporting, then nothing's going to happen. And so we did research to actually find out under which circumstances or what are facilitators and what are hurdles to make people report. And in a nutshell, one of the main findings was that a lack of trust in the police is one of the biggest hurdles for reporting, but also a decreased well-being. And so that becomes sort of a vicious circle. Yeah, you become victim of a hate crime, you're not trusting the police, your well-being goes down, but that also means that you're not going to report the next time it happens. And unfortunately, victims of hate crimes do have a very high likelihood of re-victimization, namely that it happens to you again. And if I may add an example, recently in Amsterdam, there was a gay couple that became a victim of sort of on-street discrimination, also physical violence, twice within a month. And that is sort of a textbook example of re-victimization. Luckily, they stepped to the police and reported and also went very public, but that is not the standard. There is a large group of victims that then open up during research, in a research context, during an interview, and come up with a year-long, very sad history of hate crime experiences. And they've never done anything with it besides letting it, eat themselves up.
And I mean, you spoke that trust in the police is one area and mental well-being is another. Did you look at the effects of being intersectional, being also a woman or also a person of colour, and what that would have on one's willingness to come forwards or not?
Well, we couldn't really investigate this in large numbers because we couldn't find access to a lot of hate crime victims that are coming with an intersectionality background. It makes it even more difficult because you kind of expect from such a victim to be able to clearly attribute a specific incident. This is due to either my gender or my ethnicity, or this is due to my sexual orientation. And the nature of intersectionality is actually it's interacting. But what is interesting in the few cases that we have interviewed, that we had in our focus group discussions, is that oftentimes the LGBT hate crime is more so attributed to, for example, an ethnic or cultural background rather than an LGBT context. So they would say, well, yeah, that happened because I am Turkish, and the fact that I'm gay didn't play such a big role. So there is also something interesting happening within these individuals. But yeah, it's hitting them hard, and it's hitting them in a double way.
That's actually quite interesting, the sense that almost people would go to their other identities before going to their identity as LGBTQ.
Well, it's not so surprising, Alastair, if you think about it, because let's take the example for gay men with a Muslim background, Turkish or Moroccan. It is often the case that their acceptance of their own homosexuality is challenged because they have a lot of internalized homophobia in them. because that's what is the norm in their community, and or the perceived norm in their community, which really creates an extra burden, and then it's almost a logical consequence that you denounce your sexual orientation as a reason, and you push your cultural background into the foreground, because it almost does that by itself.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense in that regard, that you take the one which almost has been put forward as something that has been a target of hatred for so much longer, arguably, than what is a relatively newer kind of perceived offence in terms of acceptability. It's much more recent that it's been a hate crime for LGBTQ persons than for misogyny or for racism.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. But you're pointing to a very timely investigation. Yeah? We need to move away from this shoebox approach of we're only looking at LGBT. We are in our lives a member of many identities at the same time, and some of them interact in a very innocent way, and others interact in more problematic ways. And we need to look at these intersectionalities much more closely, and they appear in a lot of contexts, and also in contexts where we often don't expect them to occur. This can also be linked to religious faith and beliefs, which can be almost as complicated as cultural or ethnic backgrounds. So yeah, there is a lot of room for future research. And luckily, there is broad interest. There is a group in the UK that studies that, and we are still doing work together with my colleagues from COC, that's the LGBTQI community group in Amsterdam, and colleagues at University of Amsterdam. So luckily, there is interest in it, and our research is very well received.
So you say it's well received, and you said earlier that the police have improved in recent years in their ability to handle this through specific units. What else would you like to see develop to improve the handling of?
What we need, what our results show, is that sort of the initial reception of a hate crime victim by these specialized police units is quite good. The problems arise sort of later down the road. The role of a victim or a witness in a criminal court context is not as strong. There's often support lacking. Support groups that work specifically with hate crime victims are often not up to date when it comes to LGBT hate crime victims. They're sort of looking at the classical type of victim, and so we really need to improve the continuous and long-term support and counseling for hate crime victims. It's not enough to get them to report. We need to support them at a longer and continuous path, because it just doesn't end with reporting. Interestingly, though, when we looked at our survey data, we saw that a lot of the victims don't really seek a criminal punishment of the perpetrators. That is sort of a second or third priority. What's important for them is to be recognized, to be acknowledged, and also not to have to continuously retell their story and basically reclaim their rights or their recognition of victimhood. And if you continuously have to do that, that really takes a toll, and that has an impact on your well-being, and that can lead to quite serious consequences in terms of your behavior. And what we've seen, the range of consequences, is that people move to other neighborhoods if they can. but also they stay at home. They don't go out. They try to not become identifiable as LGBTQI, which is really the opposite of any sort of free identity and the performance of your identity.
It almost works to internalize the individual moment, which you then have to live with over and over again.
Yeah, and you're lacking social support. You're basically just staying home in what you perceive the safest place. And if actually the violence or the hate crime has been committed by your neighbors, then it becomes a really challenged situation. And we've been investigating that for a number of years. Like, what's the perceived violence and or safety in a neighborhood context? And unfortunately, a number of LGBT individuals, often of a lower socioeconomic status, are living in very precarious contexts and do not have a lot of possibilities to move, which is easier for someone who is more flexible or who has more monetary funds at their disposal.
It's a lot to factor into what, at the end of the day, is needed to really assist those people moving forwards.
Yeah, and it's really, it's the question of what is the long term consequence. If it happens once to you and you really think, okay, I shouldn't go out in the evening, or I should only go out if someone else is joining me, then your lives become there is the potential that your lives can become very small and narrow. And that's not what we want. And we don't want to end up sort of with a internalized curfew for hate crime victims. That's absolutely the opposite of where we should move towards. But there is a very high likelihood that unsupported victims are experiencing exactly that.
Mm. And I think now maybe, I mean, that's quite an abrupt place because it's a lot to take in. But maybe we should talk a bit more about the rest of your work, because you've published a phenomenally large amount from what I can tell. So what are you most proud of? What work really stands out to you?
Well, to be honest, I don't have a specific article that I'm extremely proud of, because for me, they all tie into a larger body of work, and I think that's where I hope to make an impact on a larger scale. Of course, there are some articles that were really hard to get published or are in a quite prestigious journal, and that's what you're happy about. But sometimes it's really the work that I can publish with a junior scholar, a young PhD student, where I can really see that also helped him or her in their sort of academic career, and that really led them to grow. And that's something that I'm maybe even more proud of, rather than the content of a specific article.
That's a very nice response, actually. And just before we came on air, you were talking about how the field had changed across your time researching in it, and how you almost preferred the work you were doing now in terms of its applied nature and more practical implications. And I know obviously it's a lot to think into the future, but where do you see your research going?
Well, I think my research in the context of HIV prevention and mental health will converge more. We see a lot of substance use among especially gay populations worldwide that is very scary and will have very severe mental health and physical consequences. So I doubt that we will talk a lot about HIV prevention in a number of years. That's not because it's solved and it's done, though that will be very hard and difficult to reach the last 10%. But the advent of really an increased amount of substance use in a very broad group of LGBTQI individuals is very worrying to me, and I'm very concerned about that. And I think that's where we'll see sort of a tie between mental health issues and associated physical health issues, especially when there are health risks tied to it quite directly. But that's where I see we will have to do a lot of work, and that's also where I see that the healthcare providers and mental health care providers are sitting on two different islands and not really talking to each other, and we have to walk quite a long path to bring these together and to be able to provide the care and support to these vulnerable populations in a way that it really can make improve their lives.
And I mean, this almost links into what we were talking about earlier, the fact that intersectionality and looking at almost a more holistic approach to how you tackle a problem. Do you think that will continue to become more and more prevalent, that you'll look at, well, this and this together and how this impacts that?
Yeah, that is happening. We move continuously away from these monocausal approaches to more syndemic or polycausal approaches. But one of the really big challenges also will be to understand why certain parts of an LGBT population is or remains vulnerable, while, let's say, the other half is leading very happy and unchallenged lives. And that will be a big demand and challenge for us to find out what are really these early determinants, these factors that sort of almost at a very early T intersection in your life determine if you turn left and everything will be fine, and you will always say, well, I never experienced any discrimination, I had a happy life and I have a great career and I have a loving partner and everything's fine and dandy, while you have someone else that kind of turned the other way and it's just a downward spiral, or it's very, very challenging. And that's, I think, really interesting to also find out what is determining this either advantageous or challenged path that people walk in their lives, and how we can improve the challenged path, but also how we can make sure that more people can turn left rather than right.
That is a very interesting kind of why someone ends up very happy, very successful in terms of their mental well-being and their confidence, their perception of themselves, where someone in a very similar situation may not.
Yeah.
At this time, if anyone in the audience has any questions, please feel free to ask them. Otherwise, I am just noticing we are getting towards the end of our half an hour. So it's been very, very interesting to have you. And thank you very much. So I'll just give it 20, 30 seconds, if that's okay, because I'm aware there's a slight delay on the stream. Otherwise,
that's fine.
I will let you go. Okay. No one seems to have any questions. So obviously you've explained your field of research to the highest degree possible. And I would like to thank you very, very much for giving up your half an hour on your Wednesday evening.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's lovely to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.